An assassin who has claimed the lives of over 30 people inside the octagon and somehow has never been caught and still walks the streets till this day. Yes, you've guessed it. We're going to be taking a look at the hit TV show Dexter. No, just kidding. Instead, we'll be looking at a real life natural born killer. A man who has won UFC interim gold, was on the losing side of one of the worst decisions in UFC title fight history, and has even been called one of the best fighters in history to have never won UFC undisputed gold by Dana White himself. Yes, today we'll be taking a deep dive into the career of Carlos, the natural born killer Condit. Carlos Joseph Condit had a unique upbringing, to say the least. It was actually believed originally that he was born into royalty. With his father being the king of Olympus, Acrisius, and his mother the queen, he would be set to live an extremely comfortable life as a future king. However, things weren't that simple. You see, it would soon be discovered that Carlos was actually half man and half god, with his father being Mario Yamasaki, the leader amongst the MMA Just Bleed gods. His purpose was simple. He was put on this earth for one reason and one reason only. His duty was to take on a force that was absolutely ravaging through the UFC welterweight division. George the Kraken St. Pierre. Growing up, Carlos would actually resist his natural born instincts to kill, instead turning to activities such as swimming and cooking. Not that there's anything wrong with these things, and they would actually eventually even plant the seed for what he would do in his retirement, but they were just simply far from what his purpose in life was. It wasn't until the age of 9 until Carlos would finally give in to his urges and embrace his journey as an assassin. Beginning with wrestling and later on picking up BJJ in kickboxing, Carlos would make his professional debut in 2002 and quickly fall in love with the sport. It would be an Aztec Challenge 1 where Carlos would claim his first body. Nick Rosorla, a poor accountant who had just stumbled upon Carlos's path and would leave his home for the last time that day. From this day on, Carlos would accept his purpose in life and completely embrace it. You might even say that it was on this day that the natural born killer was born. Following his submission against the innocent accountant, Carlos would continue to collect souls and would actually fight 6 times within the span of a year following his debut. This would make him at the time 5-0 in MMA and 0-1 in kickboxing, beating the likes of former title challengers and world champions such as Anthony Zamora, Yarel McElroy, and Tommy Pickles, and finishing everybody at that. And like I mentioned, he would even dip his toes into the world of kickboxing. However, for some god-forsaken reason, he was making his kickboxing debut against Andy Sauer, a kickboxer who at the time held a record of 93-1. Yeah, so needless to say, the natural born killer wasn't going to be killing anybody that night. However, it would be this experience that Carlos would go on to say would teach him leaps and bounds about weight cutting. At only 19 years old, Carlos only had to lose 8 pounds in order to make weight for his fight against Andy. By today's standards, most fighters wish, and I mean they would be ecstatic if they only had to lose 8 pounds for a fight. A couple hours in the sauna and they'd be good to go. But because Carlos knew absolutely nothing about weight cutting, he had to lose weight in the only way he knew how, which was to just stop eating food. 4 days prior to the fight, Carlos would completely stop all consumption of food. And I mean, fair play to him. He did make weight for that fight against Andy. But because weigh-ins were only 7 hours before the fight, he definitely wasn't going to be fighting at his best. After his debut in kickboxing, Carlos would return to MMA and was going at a pace that only Travis Fulton could relate to, With 6 fights in 2004, 7 in 2005, and 7 in 2006, the natural-born killer was going on an absolute killing spree. This spree would include his return to kickboxing, where he would pick up 4 wins, and his debut in boxing, where he would unfortunately lose. However, it would be in MMA where he was truly shining and finishing every win he had. I mean, like any other fighter, or 99% of them, he would find himself losing during this stretch, but wouldn't stay in the losing column too long. And in fact, he would soon find himself winning and defending the WEC welterweight strap. He was becoming everything the MMA just bleed gods were hoping for. I mean, I'm probably showing right now on the screen right here, Carlos absolutely mollywhopping some fools, and it's probably hilarious. However, his purpose would not be able to be fulfilled in the WEC. Instead, Carlos would need to make his move into the UFC, which is exactly what he did. Carlos would make his UFC debut on April 1st, 2009 against Martin Kampmann, aka the day that Tony Ferguson would lose fucking 10-8 to a set of cables 9 years later. Anyways, Carlos would actually go on to lose via split decision to Martin, but would luckily wake up the natural-born killer inside of him. This fight would prompt Carlos to pick up 5 quick kills and put 5 nude bodies into the basement, and shortly after send out a UAV and Predator missile. On this spree, he would pick up wins over none other than Jake Ellenberger, Roy McDonald, the guy who does Inside the Octagon and commentates on European UFC fight nights. Oh yeah, Dan Hardy, that guy. Dong Young Kim, and none other than Nate Diaz himself for the interim welterweight championship. I mean, clearly, Carlos was not messing around once he got into the UFC and was poised to fulfill his destiny. However, before we go any further, there's 2 things that I want to bring up. First off, for the people who may not know, it would actually be in his fight against Nick Diaz, where Nick would, for the first time utter the words,
We're throwing spin and shit now?
I mean, this may seem super insignificant to most people, but if you've watched some UFC, or even if you've memed around a little bit, I'm sure you've probably heard this phrase used a ton. And secondly, I would like to share with you a story that Michael Bisping has gone on to say about Carlos. I mean, I could say it myself, but I'm sure it would be much better if you've heard it from the Cyclops himself.
And then this guy says to Carlos Condit, another one of the Special Forces guys, he says to Carlos Condit, "Do you want to spar?" And Carlos goes, "Yeah, sure. All right, no problem." And by the way, they call him the natural born killer. That guy is cool as fuck. Never raises his voice. He's just super mellow. He's like, "Yeah, sure. I'll spar. No problem." And they put the gloves on and they get in the ring. And then the Special Forces guy says, he says, "How hard do you want to spar?" And Carlos says, "Well, I'll hit you as hard as you hit me," which, you know, is a fair answer. But I also thought it was it was a very cool answer. It's like, well, listen, if you want to go hard, motherfucker, we'll go hard. But if you want to keep it light and friendly, we'll keep it light and friendly. The ball is in your court. So the guy says, "Okay, cool." All of a sudden, right then and there, the Special Forces guy, bang, sucker punches him as hard as he can. And I mean a fucking hard shot, right? Bearing in mind, we're at the top of a mountain in Afghanistan, in a war zone, a very, very small base. These guys are running the show. They've all got machine guns, etc., etc. We're just there. There's me, Carlos Condit, BJ Penn, Uriah Faber, and a UFC PR guy. You know, so fair to say, if shit hits the fan, we're going to get shot up and never seen again. Anyway, so this guy hits Carlos in the face as hard as he can, shakes his head, right, you know, gets his shit together, and then just goes at the guy. Jab, right hand, left head kick, boom, knocks the fucking Special Forces dude unconscious. Right? And everyone's looking around in the room. Everyone's like, "Holy shit." And I'm like, "Oh, Carlos, I'm not sure that was the smartest thing to do, for fuck's sake. I don't want to die up here." But fair play to Carlos Condit. And my point of the story is, ever since I saw that, I was like, he's a bad motherfucker, man. He's a great guy.
Either way, back to the UFC. It was time. The match was set. November 17th, 2012 was the day that Georges St. Pierre was supposed to become another body in the basement of Carlos Condit. And after a massive head kick, it seemed like it was all going to come true. But unfortunately, George stared right in the face of death and said, "Not today," and would ultimately lead himself into a decision victory for the Canadian. However, Carlos saw this as only a setback and still wanted to pursue UFC gold. Following the loss, he would then lose to Johnny Hendricks, avenge his loss versus Martin Kampmann, suffer an injury versus Woodley, and beat Thiago Alves. This was set the stage for his next shot at UFC gold against Robbie Lawler in 2016, in a fight that would go down as one of the worst decisions in UFC title fight history. Well, that was before the picogram and juicing abusing Jones versus the collegiate athlete and football player Dominic Reyes, of course. Anyways, unfortunately for Carlos, he would go on to lose his second shot at UFC gold. But he did put on a show at that. I mean, if you're going to go and watch a fight, go and watch, or a round at that, go and watch the 5th round of that fight. Because holy, those boys were fucking throwing bombs at each other. And honestly, 99% of the people who watch that fight, who don't need sticks to walk, even scored it for Carlos. But unfortunately for him, 2 of the 3 judges scoring the fights that night were in that 1%. Either way, it would be this loss that seemed to suck the killer out of Carlos and would ultimately lead him going a bit of a skid and then retiring. To recap, Carlos has definitely lived up to his name as the natural born killer. He's been in the octagon with some of the best fighters in the world and has come out on top many, many times. Unfortunately, things didn't always go his way, and he just wasn't able to get his hands on undisputed gold. But hey, an interim belt is still a belt, and I don't care what anybody says. You will always be a champion to me, Carlos. I mean, not that that means anything, and I'm sure you don't give one fuck what I say, but yeah, I said it. So yeah, that's it. Carlos Condit, ladies and gentlemen. Hope you enjoyed. Peace. Yes, dude.